welcome everybody to the 2014 Henry A. Kissinger Prize. I'd like to invite Joseph Joffe to the microphone, who will introduce this evening's program.
Good evening, presidents, ministers, excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, friends of the Academy. My name, as you heard, is Joseph Joffe. I'm a founding member of the of the American Academy, which asked me 24 hours ago to be the Master of Ceremony and welcome you to this 8th annual Henry Kissinger Prize Award. Now, I agreed immediately because I remember our friend and founder, Richard Holbrooke. Of him, Henry Kissinger has said, "You better do right away what he asks you to do, because it's going to be a lot more painful if you refuse and then end up doing it anyway." So I did. So let me tell you what awaits you now. First, the music, as you see, is by the Curtis Institute of Music, one of the greatest music academies in the world. They have been to the Academy many times thanks to Nina von Maltzahn, who is a trustee of both the Curtis Institute and the American Academy. And among the alumni of Curtis are Leonard Bernstein and Lang Lang. Now, after these fine young musicians, it will be the turn again of our chairman and president, Michael Hoffman. He will not play any instrument, but he'll give you a short intro to the ceremony. Then comes a man, if he gets here on time, otherwise we'll switch him around a little bit. Then comes the man who navigated Germany through the post-crash crisis, Wolfgang Schäuble, the German Minister of Finance, and in his long career, the minister of almost everything. He was, so to speak, the Jim Baker of German politics. He will be followed by the longest-serving preceded by the longest-serving foreign minister of all time, if you don't count his colleague Andrei Gromyko, namely Hans-Dietrich Genscher, a world-famous traveler who was often seen in two planes at once. Many of you will remember Mr. Genscher's famous silhouette at the German embassy in Prague. He still casts a very long shadow, and we are honored to have him with us. Next up, Henry Kissinger. His tenure isn't quite as long as Genscher's, but there are more quips, jokes, and anecdotes about him than about Talleyrand and Bismarck. That tells you where he ranges in history. So my favorite one is about his self-effacing modesty. When appointed Secretary of State, the press gang that knew him from the White House asked him, "So tell us, what do we have to call you now? Should we call you Dr. Kissinger? Should we call you Mr. Secretary? Or like before, can we call you Henry?" And he said, "I don't stand on protocol. Your Excellency will do just fine." He just published his magnum opus, World Order, which I want to praise enthusiastically, though praising Henry has its own pitfalls. Ages ago, I reviewed his other great book, Diplomacy, in Süddeutsche Zeitung, and I heap praise upon praise on him, 20 paragraphs. In the last paragraph, 21, I said, the German translation isn't very good, so read the original. Then I went to New York to see him, and I expected to be patted on the back. Instead, he growled in his Anglo-Franconian accent, "What are you trying to do? Are you trying to ruin the sale of my book in Germany?" But I love him very much. Then we will get a little movie there, I assume, namely John Kerry video from Washington in his address to the Academy. After Henry, And after Carrie, Gail Burt and Gary Smith, the director, will officially hand the prize to Jim Baker. Now, Gail Burt is the vice chair of the has been the vice chair of the Academy since the very beginning. And together with Richard Holbrook, whom I already mentioned, she is one of the principal reasons why the Academy exists. So this will take a few minutes because we have to let the press up to take some photos. But let me just tell you who else got the prize to put you in the proper mood. Ewald von Kleist, posthumously, George Shultz, Helmut Kohl, Mike Bloomberg, Richard von Weizsäcker, George H.W. Bush, Helmut Schmidt. Then, the last in this series, the most recent, Secretary Baker will then offer a few remarks. This evening you're going to hear a lot about his biography, so I can be very, very brief. Given his many offices, he is what the British call the permanent government of the United States. He also presided over history, as you will hear more than once, history in the making, the arduous diplomatic process of German reunification. But that's not enough in this embarrassment of riches. German Minister of the Interior, the former Defense Minister Thomas de Maizière, will be joining us in the audience just in time for what comes next, a discussion between Secretary Baker and Secretary Kissinger, moderated by Wolfgang Ischinger, the chairman of the Munich Security Conference. The grand finale, I hope, will be delivered by the director, Gary Smith. And I'll be very brief again. He has been in this position for 17 years, and he made the place what it is. Then you can take a little rest. You'll hear music again. The Curtis String Sextet will take us out with a Brahms Poco Allegro from String Sextet number 2. And then the best part. We will invite you all to the Hans Arnold Center up the hill for a reception and further discussion. So, thank you very much for coming tonight. And now I would like to welcome again the chairman and president of the American Academy, Michael Hoffman. Ladies and gentlemen.
As Joe Joffe has explained, this is a very distinguished music school, conservatoire in Philadelphia, and an outstanding group which Nina von Maltzahn has been very close to for many years. We are delighted that during their tour here in Europe, they were able to come and spend part of an evening with us. So please, we look forward to your music. so much, and a terrific thank you to Nina, who made this possible, and Nina von Maltzahn, and to the Curtis School of Music. What a remarkable presentation and piece that was. Just spectacular. I've introduced myself previously. I will do just briefly. I'm Michael Hoffman. I'm chairman of the Academy. And I welcome you, Federal President Köhler, Secretary Baker, Secretary Kissinger, Minister Schäuble, very pleased that you could join us, Minister Genscher, Minister Fisher, Ambassador Emerson, Excellencies, American Academy trustees, benefactors, and friends, ladies and gentlemen. We have quite a program lined up for this evening, as you heard from Joe Joffe, all the more fitting as this is a particularly meaningful year for the Academy and for this prize. As you know, it is also our 20th anniversary. Before I begin, however, let me first thank the individuals and the companies who have underwritten this evening's prize ceremony. We're grateful to the Bloomberg Philanthropies, the Honorable and Mrs. Husang Ansari, the Honorable Edward P. and Mrs. Francois Jerzian, Robert Bosch, GmbH, Goldman Sachs and Company, the Honorable John F.W. Rogers, the Unternehmensgruppe Tengelmann, Helga and Erwin Haub, and of course Nina von Maltzahn. Ladies and gentlemen, exactly 25 years ago this October, cracks began to appear in the wall that had divided Europe and this city for nearly 5 decades. I'm particularly aware of that since I had the fortune or misfortune of actually being here as a 16-year-old in August the 13th, 1961, when the wall went up in Berlin. And it made a tremendous impression on me, and I was so happy to see it come down again. The so-called Autumn of Nations began with scores of protesters in Eastern Europe and East Germany from all levels of society who opposed one-party rule and state oppression. And on exactly this day, 25 years ago, in fact, Mikhail Gorbachev visited Berlin to celebrate the 40th anniversary of the GDR. He urged the East German leadership at that point to accept more reform. They did not, of course. In Leipzig, 70,000 political dissidents faced down communist arms in the Monday demonstrations. In Berlin on November 4th, the Alexanderplatz demonstrations drew 500,000 protesters to the East German capital, organized by the city's actors and theater employees. These popular sentiments were amplified by figures such as Chancellor Helmut Kohl, Hans-Dietrich Genscher, Douglas Hurd from the United Kingdom, Ronald Reagan, George H.W. Bush, all who urged the expansion of democratic values that would lead to the beginning of the end of the Cold War. As the events of November 1989 unfurled, no Secretary of State was more key than our honored guest tonight. He was present in the halls of Washington, Bonn, and Moscow as negotiations got underway regarding a unified Germany, the trajectory of NATO, and the future of the Soviet Union. As Bill Clinton said of Chancellor Kohl 3 years ago at this very same ceremony, think of all the decisions that had to be made after the Berlin Wall fell. He answered every single one of them right. We would say the same thing about Foreign Minister Genscher and President Bush, and we would undoubtedly say it of James Baker, the 61st United States Secretary of State, whose tenure in office between 1989 and 1992 saw some of the most world-altering geopolitical events of the second half of the 20th century. Tonight we will hear from a number of distinguished speakers who witnessed these events up close and who have come to join in congratulating you, Secretary Baker, on receiving this prize. which recognizes an esteemed figure in international diplomacy for his or her outstanding service to the transatlantic relationship. We are honored by your presence, and we thank you for making this long trip to accept the 2014 Henry A. Kissinger Prize. With that, it is my pleasure to turn the stage over to the German Minister, Wolfgang Schäuble.
Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, James Baker needs a total of 3 people to give speeches in his honor. One person only probably wouldn't manage to talk about all of Baker's achievements. I am probably the right person to pay tribute to his finance policies. Secretary of the Treasury, very important position, by the way. Secretary of the Treasury, James Baker, it's the stage of his career. That sounds a little unfamiliar to most of us, but that was also an important position held by James in the second half of the 18th. And so I have recalled the fiscal policy challenges during that period. I hope you all will allow a serving finance minister to scrutinize the policies of the past with a view to learning lessons for the present. I was interested to read that although Baker was successful in his efforts to weaken the dollar at the time, he was not able to convert America's negative trade balance into a surplus. And this experience should be a lesson for those of our European partners who believe today that artificially weakening the euro through monetary policy would boost their weak exports. I will not torture you with European problems. It's interesting to note that James Baker had to deal with a debt crisis of his own during his time at the helm of the Treasury. That crisis related to over-indebted Latin American countries. And it's also interesting to note that it was a prolonged process of trial and error, very similar to today, with a mix of debt rescheduling and fiscal and structural reforms, which diffused the situation at the least. As Secretary of State, and I hope I will not preempting Hans-Dietrich Genscher here, but this is the advantage of speaking first, coming late, speaking first. But I have to apologize because I had to join, and I have to join a meeting of our coalition leading committee, and I left it to bring the regards and the greetings and the wishes from Chancellor Merkel, Vice Chancellor Gabriel, and all the members, which are all honored, and we are all thanks to you for you being here and what you did 25 years ago. So I am, as Secretary of State, the position James Baker took in January 1989, he wanted to take advantage of the opportunities that he saw for a far-reaching détente in East-West relations. Indeed, in the period before November 1989, the Americans, as often, were ahead of us Europeans in their perception and analysis of the global political changes that were on the horizon and that were already beginning to happen, mainly as a result of Gorbachev's policies. I will never forget the time when Vernon Walters, the new US ambassador to Germany, introduced himself. To me, it was the end of April, start of May 1989, and I had just been appointed as Interior Minister. Walters predicted that German reunification would happen during his term in office. I tried to be diplomatic, asked him how long he would be in Germany for. He told me 3 years. At that time, in our vision, it was a bold statement, to say the least. But in the end, everything happened even faster than that. I knew that Secretary Baker was not amused that Vernon Walters was so outspoken in that time. But in substance, he was right. And that is a proof that the world's superpower was much more farsighted than we Germans and we Europeans. James Baker visited East Germany in December 1989. He met Hans Modrow, the last prime minister of East Germany. No, it's not the last prime minister of the socialist state of East Germany. He was not democratically elected. And so James Baker was the first and the last, and therefore the only US Secretary of State to set foot in the GDR. He would later recall the following amusing incident. While he was talking to Modrow, a man suddenly came into the room. I don't know whether you remember, James. He looked like Egon Krenz, who had just stepped down as the General Secretary of the East German Communist Party and East German head of state. And James Baker thought to himself, now there is going to be trouble. But then the man asked him if he would like some mineral water. It was just the waiter. Myself, I first met James Baker in Washington on the 20th of February 1990 during my I was visiting New York for a special session of the United General Assembly on drugs. I combined this with talks in Washington, which were originally supposed to also focus on the issue of drugs, what is for an interior minister. But the people I met were mainly interested in the current situation in Germany. And James Baker asked me what we would do about the Oder-Neiße line in the event of reunification. I told him that we could only comment on borders if and when reunification actually happened. But I added that there was absolutely no doubt that we would issue a clear guarantee regarding the existing border. And then he asked me about Article 23 of the basic law of the German Constitution. That shows how well he was informed. I answered by saying that this article would be repealed. I gave him the explanation. If we kept open the option for additional areas, that was Article 23 of the former Grundgesetz, if we kept open the option for additional areas to join the territory covered by German's basic law, that would contradict the desire to use German reunification to create the condition for lasting peace in Europe. Imagine we wouldn't have cancelled this Article 23 from our constitution. I have to confess, my colleagues in Bonn, including the Federal Chancellor Helmut Kohl, were a little bit alarmed with the comments I had made. Comments that were made in the context of my discussion with James Baker, which were actually totally sensible and realistic. In any case, I was probably the first member of the German government to announce that the border would be guaranteed in the constitution. A few months later, we did exactly that with the Unification Treaty. It's also a historical fact that at that time, the Americans, unlike some of our European friends, supported the move towards reunification without any reservation. The US, as a superpower, was not afraid of a reunited Germany. Rather, the US had the greatness to support us and trust in us. And this support for us has been essential to get the reunification. And we will never forget that without American support, we would never achieve what we get and what was the most lucky moment in our history. And therefore, even today, as a member of and on behalf of the acting German government, I would like to thank you, James Baker, and I would like you all, the United States of America. The Henry A. Kissinger Prize, which James Baker is receiving today, is awarded for contributions to transatlantic relations. For my generation, I have been born in 1942, compared with Henry Kissinger, really young. Huh? Sometimes I was together with Henry Kissinger, Helmut Schmidt, and George Shultz, and I said, oh, it's quite nice for me. I feel very young in your company. For my generation, the strong relationship between Germany and the US is deeply rooted. I have always trusted the US. How could it be otherwise after all the positive experience we had with our American partners and friends when Germany was divided? After the Berlin airlift, the Berlin crisis, and the fall of the Berlin Wall. That is stronger than certain more recent sources of friction. And today, in the face of new common threats, Europe and the US stand united. The Western world's response to the challenges presented by the current Russian government and by Islamic State is more concerted and more decisive than we have seen for a long time. James Baker has a gift for forging alliances. His virtuoso performance in 1990-1991, when he managed to unite the West and most of the Middle East in a coalition against Saddam Hussein's illegal annexation of Kuwait, can be seen as a practical and diplomatic refutation of the so-called clash of civilizations before Samuel Huntington even proposed the theory in 1996. The decades of James Baker's political career are testament to his tireless efforts to counter the world's crises and conflicts. From the Baker Plan to relive Third World debt to his Middle East peace mission in 1991 and his efforts as Special United Nations envoy for Western Sahara around the turn of the millennium to his work as the Republican co-chair of the Iraq Study Group in the year 2006, tasked with assessing Americans' policies toward Iraq. Years ago, a German newspaper referred to him as a one-man rapid response team against political crisis. And in the current debate about the US strategy against Islamic State, James Baker is as much of a presence as ever before. James Baker once said something about fiscal policies that I believe to be true of policy making in general. He said, I quote, almost every achievement contains within its success the seeds of a future problem. It's true, if worrying inside. On the other hand, it is just a variation of the Christian realization that humans cannot achieve ultimate justice in this world. And Albert Camus showed us that we should think of Sisyphus as a happy man. Also, his task is never ending. At least he has a task, and it is his own. James Baker never gives up looking for achievements that contain as few seeds of future problems as possible. And that is also a shining, inspiring example indeed. And therefore, we are honoring a man who really deserves this honor. Congratulations.
Thank you, Minister Schäuble. I'd now like to invite Minister Hans-Dietrich Genscher to the microphone.
Meine sehr verehrten Damen und Herren, dear friends Henry and James, the Henry Kissinger Prize is being awarded to James Baker in Berlin 25 years after the fall of the Berlin Wall. I think it would be hard to select a date more symbolic than this date. 25 years, that means remembering what happened in a very hard time for Germany. And we can say now that James Baker and Henry Kissinger again and again were involved in German questions. In Henry Kissinger, not because of the place of his birth, but in his capacity as Foreign Secretary, and the same is true for James Baker. They were always involved in supporting German unity. when Kissinger not only, as well made, his place of birth was involving him and encouraging him. But when I met him for the first time as Foreign Secretary, I had on my agenda two issues, a European one and a German one. The European one was very complicated because at that time I was chairman of the Community Council of Ministers, and I had the task to convince my American colleague that the Europe-Arab dialogue is a wonderful thing and will change the world to the better. Unfortunately, Henry Kissinger had some doubts, and he was very open in giving him assessment about this dialogue, and he was right. Then we came to the German issue. Germany's issue was more significant and more crucial. It was all about wording of the final act of Helsinki, the purpose of which was to strengthen the principle of inviolability of borders. German foreign policy supported this principle, of course, but it could be taken to make the borders doubtful. That means to exclude peaceful change too. And that was the reason why we insisted that in the final act, the possibility of peaceful change should be included. I could convince Henry Kissinger, and he asked me to give a wording, and he committed himself that the American delegation would support our proposal. I answered, thank you very much, Mr. Secretary, for your support, but I think it would be more impressing for Gromyko when the Americans will present the wording and Germany will support you. He agreed, and really in the final round of negotiations, we were in a position to include the peaceful change in the final act. And in 89, 90, it would be clear how important it was. We, of course, had this political goal, but it was also the part of the obligations we had from our constitution in the preamble, which said we had to fulfill German unification. I have today to thank in particular James Baker for the way how he was on our side from the beginning. We owe this gratitude, of course, also to President Bush, who from the beginning was on our side, which made it easier to overcome some concerns which had taken place in the heads of some of our friends, real friends and other friends here in Germany. Unfortunately, when James Baker came into office to remark to my friend Schäuble, I met him also as Secretary of Finance, and this was a very happy day for him because the first dollar note with his signature was circulated at that day in Washington, and he gave me a note with his signature, and I was very grateful and said normally I did not accept money from other colleagues, but on this very occasion I will do that. When he came in as foreign minister, situation was more complicated. At that time, we were discussing in NATO the question of modernization of short-range missiles. This was an issue which brought up the famous Prime Minister of Britain. She insisted that the decision should be taken on the spring meeting in May '89. but it was necessary already at 94, 95, but she insisted it should take place in 89. I had my doubts, and unfortunately, my doubts were not shared by all members of our government, to put it in that way, and this was well known in Washington. So my first meeting as Foreign Minister with the new Secretary of State, whom I met already some years ago when he was in the White House, and then, as I mentioned before, as Minister of Finance. Now we were discussing this question, and then we had the meeting of NATO summit in May 89 in Brussels. Helmut Kohl, our Chancellor, proposed that the foreign ministers should solve the problem. This was not discussed between us, but I accepted. And then I had to deal with James Baker. And we were happy to find a compromise to say we will do it later. And this was right because I was convinced, I was very happy with the outcome of the decision. And with this date, we had a new personal relationship, a relationship which was more than friendship, a relationship would prove to be a strong pillar for German-American relations in very crucial times. That means during the years 89 and 90. And Jim, you should know that I never will forget how I could rely on this support, also among the circle of foreign ministers in the European, in the NATO Council. But what is more important is that our relationship was obvious also to our colleague Eduard Shevardnadze. Even more, he was impressed how we worked together, and sometimes I had the impression he would prefer to work with us and not with some members of his Politburo at home. So it was not by chance. Then on the occasion of his funeral some months ago, we, James Baker and me, were the only Western political representatives who came to Tiflis to give the honor to our colleague and to thank him for that, what he did and what was courageous, was far-seeing, and seems this was a responsible man. The man whom we met first as foreign minister of a socialist country and who became our personal friend. We never will forget this, and this shows how close James Baker and I worked together. Ladies and gentlemen, on the 9th of November, this very happy day when the wall came down, I tried to thank my Western colleagues for their help and support. So I called James Baker, and the operator of the Foreign Office in Bonn connected me with Baker, and before connecting us, she said to him just 3 words: Mr. Secretary, God bless America. And today, 20 years later, I will repeat this to you, my friends, to Henry Kissinger, to James Baker, and to the American people. God bless America. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Minister Genscher, for those wonderful words. Well, I'd like now to invite a gentleman that needs no introduction, Henry Kissinger.
James, Hans Dietrich, and Wolfgang, ladies and gentlemen. I use the first names because we have gone through decades of common efforts together. And when we meet, we talk like veterans of the 30 Years' War, exchanging significant experiences. And while it is said that older people tend to lose some of their memory, my stories get better with every passing year. It is very important to me to be able to deliver this speech about my friend James Baker. Not only because he too speaks with an accent, but because he has belonged to the permanent establishment of the United States, who established the bonds of friendship with Germany and with Europe, whom one could always count on in critical periods, on whom every president relies in one way or another, if only because they know he is a fail-safe recourse. When this cooperation between America and Europe started, no one could expect that we would reach a point where Germany had been unified for 25 years, and the American Academy is also 20 years old. After 4 decades of common effort, the vision that sustained the leaders that are here has been vindicated. And Jim Baker played a major role, indispensable role. When one asks oneself, what is the role of a great leader? I would say it must have a number of attributes. 1, he has to be able to understand the nature of the situation he's confronting. Secondly, he has to be able to define objectives that operate in a given margin. If the objectives are too narrow, the society stagnates. If the objectives are too excessive, the society tears itself apart. So to choose these objectives and to be able to define both their limits but also their range is of crucial consequence. Then a leader has to be able to define the tactical means by which to reach these objectives. And the difference between a political leader and an academic is that the political leader gets only one chance. The academic can write another book. The political leader's decisions are usually irretrievable. And then the political leader in foreign policy has to understand the nature of the adversary, what to resist, but also what to conciliate and therefore to preserve. James Baker has met all these requirements in an extraordinary way. If you look at the agenda of the Bush administration at the beginning of 1989, they faced a crisis in China as a result of Tiananmen Square. They faced a crisis in the Middle East as a result of the invasion of Kuwait. They saw the collapse of the wall, the unification of Germany, and then the disintegration of the Soviet Union. Out of all these elements, they had to distill some concept of order. And there were certain basic principles that they followed. What happened in China was offensive to American democratic values. But they also understood that the relationship between China and the United States will be of permanent consequence for the peace and progress of the world. And therefore, they chose a road that met both of these requirements and evolved a new relationship. When Iraq invaded Kuwait, the issue as it was perceived by Bush and Baker was not the direct threat to the United States, which was very remote, but it was the defense of the principle that national territories and the existence of states should not be based on the assertion of raw power. And they also understood that this principle should not be executed by America alone, though if necessary, I'm convinced they would have done that too. But they spent months of effort of building a consensus, an alliance of the willing that defeated the aggression and also they had the courage to stop when they had achieved their political objective and move towards a political solution. So this, therefore, when the wall came down and the issue of the future of Europe and of Germany again arose, they followed this fundamental principle that their job was not only to celebrate the success but to build an international order that could be sustained. One of the major achievements of Bush and Baker, and I list them together because they were so close. The major achievement was that they avoided any triumphalism, that they did not rush to Berlin to celebrate the humiliation of the Soviet Union, but rather put themselves behind a realistic program for the unification of Germany. They helped bring about, with, of course, under the guidance and leadership of German leaders who are assembled here, and of Helmut Kohl, who cannot be here. They brought about a situation in which an axiom of the Cold War disappeared, namely that rapid unification of Germany would lead to an international crisis that would have an unbearable risk of war. Unification of Germany was achieved with the concurrence of the Soviet Union due to the courage of German leaders, but also to the skill and diplomacy of James Baker. When my associate, when Jim was made Secretary of State, he appointed a close associate and friend, Larry Eagleburger, as his political undersecretary. And he asked me about what advice I could give him. And I said, knowing you, you will tell your opinion to Baker in the dramatic way that is your character. But once Baker has defined an objective, my advice to you is never get between Baker and an objective. And it was this quality of ability to understand the essence of a situation, to marshal the forces that were needed to overcome it, and then to find a framework that would permit a new system in which the former adversary could participate as a partner. And that was the essence of the policy, in my view, which on the American side, under Jim Baker's guidance, the unification of Germany, the emergence of the European Union emerged, and then, beyond anybody's original expectations, extended itself to the collapse of the Soviet Union, in which again triumphalism was avoided, principles were maintained, and long-range conciliation emerged. In addition to these achievements in Europe, Jim Baker was the father of the Madrid Conference, which remains the most comprehensive forum for the solution of the Middle East problem, and out of which a number of accords between Israel and the Palestinians emerged, as well as a framework that unfortunately has not been able to be fulfilled because of the mutual suspicion of the parties. Now, 25 years later, the crisis has moved east, and what was an issue along the Elbe has moved deep into what has been what was at that time the Soviet Union. And I would argue that some of the principles that Jim Baker represented apply to this crisis too. The principle that the borders of states should remain inviolate is a crucial principle of Western policy. But the idea that in a world in which one sees the rise of Asia, the emergence of state terrorism and ungovernable regions in the Middle East and elsewhere, in such a world one should not forego the possibility of a cooperative relationship with Russia, and so to pursue both of these objectives is a task in which the principles I have enunciated that James Baker pursued in his life, that he represents within the United States, apply with particular force. So I want to thank the organizers for giving me the opportunity to express my admiration and affection for a man who comes from, I would say, not identical background as mine, with whom I have formed a close relationship because of its reliability, decency, and inner strength. And I am proud that it's associated with my name. And I want to thank, if I may, as somebody who went through the battles with you all, I want to thank Wolfgang and Hans Dietrich for the tribute you have paid him, because it shows that the dream that started the Atlantic relationship is becoming more and more valid. In 1961, a lifetime ago, I met President Truman in retirement then, and I asked him what he had done, of which he was most proud. And he said, "I'm most proud that we totally defeated our enemies. And then we brought them back to the community of nations as equals." And I am proud that Americans were involved in this. But I'm proud of all the people here who have been involved in this. And this meeting is a tribute to the years of effort and to the years of vision that lie ahead of us. Thank you very much.
I think we're now to have a brief video. If we're ready for that. A message from the current Secretary of State of the United States, John Kerry.
Guten Abend. Good evening, everybody. Even by long distance, it is a great pleasure and a privilege to congratulate my friend James Baker for receiving this year's Kissinger Prize. You know, there honestly isn't any better way to honor Jim Baker than a prize named after the Secretary of State who literally wrote the book on diplomacy. Dr. Henry Kissinger is both a son of America and Germany. And during his extraordinary career in government, Henry helped bring West Germany's economy back to life and kept the threat of communism at bay. Years after he left office, his leadership and wisdom still leave an imprint on policymakers today, and I enjoy my conversations with him enormously. Germany's transformation, just in the time span of our own lives, really is extraordinary. I lived there as a kid before the Berlin Wall went up, and decades before all Germans were free. And I used to travel on the train through East Germany and peek through the blinds at night to watch the Russian soldiers in the stations as we passed through. And of course, we all know the Germany that I knew as a child changed in the blink of an eye when the wall came down. That very moment, Secretary Jim Baker was hosting a luncheon at the State Department. And when an assistant passed him a note with the news, he read it aloud, raised his glass, and proposed a toast to the extraordinary moment and the extraordinary Germans who pried open the jaws of communism. But Jim's work was just beginning. The communist regime in Moscow collapsed so quickly that we needed an incredibly steady hand at the tiller. And Jim was that steady hand. In the pivotal weeks and months that followed, he shuttled from capital to capital to rally support for a unified Germany. He reassured leaders. He negotiated differences, and he worked hand in hand with other Kissinger Prize awardees, President George H.W. Bush and Dr. Helmut Kohl, in order to midwife a reunited Germany into NATO. 25 years later, we only have to look at recent events in Ukraine and our work to combat ISIL in Syria and Iraq in order to understand how genuinely important the unified Europe and a strong Germany are to global stability and peace today. I had a front row seat in the United States Senate to watch and appreciate the scope and scale of what Jim Baker did as Secretary of State. This is the guy who made the lonely decision to plunge headlong into the Middle East peace process at a time when there was very little support for it. And of course, to this day, his 60 trips around the world, to the Middle East, to Asia, to Europe, to assemble the coalition, to confront Saddam Hussein head of Operation Desert Storm, that is still the gold standard by which modern coalition building will be judged. These are just a few of the things that James Baker did as Secretary, and perhaps just as important is the work he's done since he left Foggy Bottom. He's been a distinct statesman, and I saw it on the issues where he spoke out, on the New START Treaty, the issue of nuclear nonproliferation, but also on Afghanistan, Iraq, and a whole number of issues. So let me just say to all of you, if you're having a foreign policy debate, you want Jim Baker on your side. So Jim, congratulations on an extraordinarily well-deserved award. I'm very grateful for your friendship, and I join with all of you this evening in thanking Jim Baker for his superb service to our country as Secretary of State and as elder statesman. Thank you, sir.
The Henry A. Kissinger Prize has been awarded annually since 2007 to a distinguished European or American who has made a lasting contribution to the transatlantic relationship. The prize was established to honor the Academy's founding chairman, Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, whose initiatives for disarmament and détente in the post-war period helped lay the foundation for democratic change in Europe, the end of the Cold War, and the reunification of Germany. The Academy honors Secretary Baker in recognition of his singular achievements over 4 decades of service in senior government positions. Secretary Baker exemplifies the most honorable traditions of American public service. His achievements at critical periods were historic and earned him recognition as one of the central figures in managing the end of the Cold War. Secretary Baker's service was characterized by both vision and pragmatism. He was unique in his ability to devise solutions to the most difficult challenges of post-war history. His astute, principled, and politically skillful approach earned him both success and respect of friends and adversaries alike. His achievements range from stabilization of Western economies in the 1980s to organization of worldwide support for the first Gulf War and negotiation of the end of the Cold War, including the reunification of Germany. In founding the James A. Baker Institute for Public Policy at Rice University, which fosters dialogue between statesmen, scholars, and students, Secretary Baker maintains his commitment to the public welfare. He has continued to advise international leaders in roles including personal envoy of UN Secretary General Kofi Annan in seeking a political solution to the Western Sahara dispute, as special presidential envoy for President George W. Bush on the issue of Iraqi debt, and as co-chair of the bipartisan Iraq Study Group. Mr. Secretary, my fellow trustees and I are very pleased to present you this award.
Henry.
Thank you for making it.
Ladies and gentlemen, I am particularly honored
that the American Academy of Berlin has given me this award, named after somebody I consider to have been and to be the best diplomat of my generation. And I am particularly honored that Henry Kissinger himself is here personally and that he personally presented me with this award. Thank you, Henry, and thanks for those wonderful words, particularly about our friendship. It goes both ways, and I think you know that. You know, ladies and gentlemen, I've always referred to Henry as the icon of American foreign policy. Because when Henry says something about international relations, people listen, and they listen very closely because he is, after all, a brilliant strategic thinker. One time, Henry and I were writing, co-authoring an op-ed on the problems in Libya. And we went through about 4 or 5 drafts. And I'm a political guy, you know, and so I like to get to the point fairly quickly. Henry is theoretical, and he's far more intellectual than I am. And I turned to him and I said, Henry, you know, we've got to punch this op-ed up. We got to make it a little bit more decisive and strengthen it a little bit and shorten it. He said, well, we could do that. But if we did, nobody would think I had anything to do with it. Henry really has been a role model for me. He mentioned the fact that when I was first named Secretary of State, I selected Larry Eagleburger, who'd been Henry's right-hand man, to be my Deputy Secretary of State. I had a number of people pick up the phone and call me and say, you're going to put Eagleburger in that job? He's a Kissinger guy. I said, yeah, that's why I'm putting him in the job. I also want to thank John Kerry for his kind words. You know, Secretary Kerry and I are on opposite sides of the political divide in the United States, but I really do admire Secretary Kerry, and I talk to him from time to time. I admire him for being willing to take on the tough issues, because it's my view that no Secretary of State can succeed unless he is willing to take risks. And Secretary Kerry doesn't hesitate to take on the difficult tasks. Let me say with respect to Germans that there is no one with whom I work more closely on the reunification of Germany than Hans-Dietrich Genscher. By the time I became Secretary of State, I already had a great respect for Hans-Dietrich's intelligence, for his leadership skills, and his ability to accomplish things, to get things done. Hans-Dietrich and Helmut Kohl, of course, were from different political parties, something that we're not particularly used to in a government, in a cabinet in the United States. But they worked together to reunite Germany, and all Germans were rewarded by their close cooperation and their effective commitment to the goal of unification. So thank you, Hans-Dietrich, for your kind remarks tonight and for being a terrific, and I mean terrific, negotiating partner and a trusted friend. And finally, I want to recognize Wolfgang Schäuble, who's provided a lifetime of service to his country. He's a strong representative of government, the most consequential finance minister in Europe today, and a committed transatlanticist. I particularly appreciate his candor. Frankly, I wish that more of the leaders in my country were as concerned about too much debt as Wolfgang is about that subject in this country. Ladies and gentlemen, let me just say I'm doubly honored to receive this award on the 25th anniversary of the fall of the wall and the end of the Cold War. What occurred in this country a quarter of a century ago was truly epic. Europe and the whole world changed with the crumbling of one barrier. Less than 11 months later, East and West Germany came together as a united Germany and a member state of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Since then, the bells of freedom have tolled across Eastern and Central Europe. None of this could ever have happened without the forthright leadership of George H.W. Bush, Helmut Kohl, Mikhail Gorbachev, Margaret Thatcher, and Francois Mitterrand, the last two a little bit later than the first three or four. But they, in the final analysis, they did set aside their differences, and they put back together a country that had been torn apart by war 45 years earlier. So as a result, that Cold War that those of my generation lived through, that Cold War ended with a whimper rather than with the nuclear bang that everybody had feared for so long. And of course, finally, none of this could ever have happened but for the indomitable spirit of the people of East Germany and those of the other captive nations of Eastern and Central Europe. Their undying yearning for freedom could not be indefinitely contained. They, ladies and gentlemen, are the true heroes of this story, and they are a vivid reminder, in my mind at least, that freedom does work. Thank you for this award, and thank you for the honor that it represents.
No, you can. I don't really know why I've been given this wonderful privilege of sitting here for, unfortunately, only a few minutes. We don't have a lot of time to ask some questions of these two amazing heroes of the foreign policy successes of the last half century. So I really feel privileged. Let me start by asking a question of both of you, and I should start with the awardee of the prize. So this goes to Secretary Baker first, and then maybe to you, Henry. I mean, you mentioned, you were talking about the 30 Years' War, the happy days of the wonderful success of German unification, and the other success stories. As we look at where we are today, it doesn't look like happy days. We face multiple crises with Russia, in the Middle East. The relationship between China and Japan raises difficult questions. And while we face all these crises, our transatlantic relationship has, let's admit it, has suffered because of the Snowden revelations, the NSA scandal. We're not in good shape. How are we supposed to move forward together? Even TTIP, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, appears to be, at risk in a way. How are we to move forward together? If you were Secretary Baker, if you were in charge today, where would you want to take us?
Well, the first thing I would like to see us do is agree on the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership. That's going to mean a lot to countries on both sides of the Atlantic, and it's an extremely important thing. Having said that, I negotiated the U.S.-Canada Free Trade Agreement back in the 80s, which was the forerunner of NAFTA, and free trade agreements are always extraordinarily tough to achieve because you create greater economic growth for people generally, and you create jobs that way, but there are always some industries or elements that get gored in the process. And they are pretty good at demagoguing against the free trade agreements. That's one of the most important things we have on the agenda, in my view. With respect to the state of the transatlantic relationship, I've seen it worse. I think it wasn't worse in my day, but I've seen it worse. But it is so important, both from, I think, from a economic and security standpoint, to the United States and to Germany and our other European partners, that it's something we constantly have to work at. And I think that we will. As I say, I remember the situation back in 2003 when the United States was about to go into Iraq, and there was a real rupture in the relationship. And we've come away since then. We got some problems, but there are so many things that we've done together throughout the period of history since the end of the Second World War that I think we're going to be able to patch that up and make it work well again. I don't feel too pessimistic about that. Yeah, there are a lot of problems out there in the world, but I want to tell you something. There are always problems out there in the world, and no Secretary of State that I've ever known had the luxury of not having an inbox that was really very full. And so I think that we will manage provided we take care of and cure the transatlantic relationship. It's extraordinarily important.
Dr. Kissinger, Henry, before you respond to this, let me try to plug your book a little bit, World Order. One other trustee of the Academy here, Roger Cohen, published a piece a few days ago with the title of The Great Unraveling, which has received a lot of attention. So are things really falling apart? Is world order unsustainable? What about the future of stability and order in Europe, in the Middle East, in East Asia? Or are we exaggerating? Are things not as bad as they appear to be? Have we gone, as you just said, have we gone through worse periods before?
Well, as Jim pointed out, crises are endemic in the international situation. What gives the current world its particular character is that for the first time, every region of the world is connected with every other region. And therefore, upheavals in one region, even if they're caused by essentially local issues, have a multiplier effect elsewhere. So the leaders of this period have to deal simultaneously with a whole host of problems under a pressure of the internet and the media, which obliges them to give quick answers to what are very often historic problems. So, on the other hand, some kind of order will have to emerge, if only through the exhaustion of all the combatants. And the art of statesmanship now is to help create this by means other than the total exhaustion of the combatants. The pressure on leaders today makes them often more concerned with tactical than with historic issues. And I would think, I have pointed out, say, in the US-Chinese relationship, both leaders have affirmed many times they want to establish a pattern of how potential adversaries can work together. But it has not yet been possible to find big programs to express this, as was done in the Marshall Plan era. So I would say, with respect to the transatlantic relationship, it would help if the leaders sat down to see whether they can come to a common definition of what the problems are that they want to solve, rather than what moves are necessary tomorrow. And if they really built that into their dialogue, and then out of this emerge the answer to three questions. What is it we must try to achieve, if necessary, alone? What should we achieve only with allies? And what shouldn't we try at all? Because it's beyond our capacity.
You know,
It can be, it will be, I think it must be done. And Immanuel Kant, who wrote not too far from here, once said, I don't know whether he used the word world order, but he said world order will come someday, either through catastrophe or through insight. And I bet on insight.
you know, you listed a catalog of problems today, and yes, they're all out there, but none of those represent the same degree of existential threat to all of us in the West as we lived through for 40 years during the Cold War. And so we ought not to be, nobody should get nostalgic for the Cold War, but the truth of the matter is it was a lot tougher then, in my view. I mean, we're going to do fine, and I think everybody's united against the kind of terror that ISIS represents. I think there's room today for putting together a coalition of countries from all over the world. I don't know any country in the world that doesn't oppose ISIS and oppose what they're doing. So I think I'm just not as pessimistic as a lot of people are. Yeah, there are a lot of problems out there, but it pales in comparison to the Cold War.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. I think we're all delighted to hear something more than just pessimistic assessments of where we're going. But I need to ask you a question not about the future, but about the past. When you look at the German media situation today in this deteriorated situation with Russia because of the Ukrainian crisis, the claim that in 1990 promises were made by the West, by the United States, by you, continue to float around.
That's right.
And it's poisonous. So I think you might want to explain to this group what happened.
I'm really glad you asked that question, because it's pure baloney. It's simply not true. I know it's in the ether out there, but let me tell you exactly what happened, and Hans-Dietrich Genscher will be my witness, because he knows he was there. When we first started talking about German unification with the Soviets, we threw out there as a what if, in terms of NATO membership, or in terms actually of agreeing to German unification, we said, what if we were to agree that NATO's jurisdiction would not be extended eastward? 3 days later, well, nobody picked up on that. President Gorbachev didn't say, fine, we'll do it, and we'll take that and put it in our bank. 3 days later, the United States changed its policy, and we did so publicly, and there was never one complaint from the Soviet Union. Why did we change our policy? Because it didn't make sense to have half of a country in NATO and the other half out of NATO. And so it wasn't a workable solution. Never once did the Soviets complain. There were a number of subsequent meetings between Gorbachev and Helmut Kohl, Gorbachev, and George Bush, where nothing was ever said. And then we had a treaty that the Soviets signed that actually permitted the unification of Germany as a member of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, with one caveat, that there would not be, for a period of time, well, I don't know what it was, 3 years or something, no forces other than the Bundeswehr on the territory of the GDR. You don't sign an agreement that you think is going to guarantee you against an eastward expansion of NATO that says the very opposite thing. Furthermore, there was a meeting between Helmut Kohl and Gorbachev. Well, first of all, let me back up. In May of '90, President Gorbachev came to the White House, and President Bush asked him this question: do you think that a country should have the right to choose the alliance to which it wants to belong? And Gorbachev said yes. And so the obvious answer to that is, well, Germany can choose which one. Well, Germany chose NATO. After that, there was a meeting between Gorbachev and Kohl in which you Germans ponied up $55 billion to the Soviets. And there was never one thing said, ever, or no Russian Soviet ever asked for any documentation to sustain this so-called promise. There was no promise. It was put out there as a hypothetical at the very beginning of the negotiations. They never picked up on it, and it wasn't a part of the final treaty which they signed. So how can they now say there was a promise?
I hope, thank you, because I hope that settles the matter, and I hope the members of the press have written this down so we can get rid of this myth.
It's phony. It's phony.
Which has been floating around so much. Thank you very much. I think we have another 5 minutes, or 5 or 7 minutes. May I go back to you, Henry? You said 20 minutes ago that it would be desirable, given the circumstances, the challenges ahead, to try to have and build a cooperative relationship with Russia. Yes, I think everybody, I imagine, in this audience will agree. But what if Russia does not want the cooperative relationship? And let me add a second question to this. Given the fact that you have not only written about world order, you wrote about China not so long ago. Is Russia, in your estimation, a problem of the past and China the problem of the future? How should we Europeans think about, the big challenges ahead?
Let me say, reply to your previous, to make one point about the previous question. The only reason I had not read Roger Cohen's article is because I was traveling, because I normally would be familiar with it. With respect to your question would you restate it?
Well, the question is, what do we do if Russia?
No, what do we do if
Russia
does not agree
refuses to
cooperate?
enter?
Well, then we have to resist. Then we are in another difficult Cold War period, and it cannot go on that there are military moves, that Russia backs its policy by military moves into neighboring countries. I believe, but it doesn't matter what I predict. I think we owe it to ourselves to ask ourselves what a cooperative relationship with Russia how it might evolve and to conduct the Ukraine policy in such a way that it protects the borders of Ukraine and leaves it open for a partnership with Russia. For this, I believe it is important that especially the United States conduct some sort of dialogue with Russia. If that fails, there is no doubt that we should maintain the principles that we have maintained before. It would be unfortunate for the West, for Russia, and so I think we have to pursue both policies simultaneously and not sacrifice one to the other. I believe it is possible. If I should turn out to be wrong, then we will defend our friends. But we should not lose sight of the importance of making sure that we have explored the possibilities of cooperation. Now, the problems between China and the United States as compared to the problems of Russia. China meets every definition of a rising country. And it is the nature of rising countries that they will step on the toes of established countries, which is a definition of rising. The challenge in the Chinese-American relationship is it possible for each side to define their interests in such a manner that they can be pursued by peaceful competition? Again, we oppose hegemony as a matter of principle. I argue, and China attempts to keep us as far from their borders as they can. Is it possible that both of these policies are carried out? That's a new challenge. It's not been met before in comparable circumstances. Now, the Russian problem is a totally different one. It's the collapse of an imperial system, of a country which has defined its authority as the protector against all kinds of outside forces, that has been invaded by Sweden, by France, by Germany, that has been governed by Mongols, by the Mongolian Empire for 400 years, 300 years, and while the West was going through its age of discovery and enlightenment and the Reformation, Russia was fighting to become Russia. So now, how do you define that power of a ruler when you are threatened on almost all of the borders? And so Russia does self-assertive things that we cannot condone. The fact that a country feels itself provoked does not entitle it to take a piece of another country. But the problem for the West with respect to Russia is how to bring it into a Western system at some point. And if possible, to avoid divisions of an intensity that make this impossible. But if that's wrong, if that cannot be done, then we have to do what we have to do. The Chinese problem is different in that sense, but if you look at the outcome of a war between China or a conflict between China and the United States means that all over the world people would have to choose between China and the United States, and it would distort the domestic politics of each country. The conflict with Russia is disturbing, but not threatening in the same sense to our future. But this may, I'm always described as a defender of the national interest. I think it is the national interest of the United States right now to see whether it can distill some kind of order out of the upheavals. Will it succeed? No, but not necessarily. But in 1947, if anyone had said the United States will undertake the defense of Europe, that Europe will unite, that Germany will unify, nobody would have thought that was very possible either. So I'm trying to define a goal and an effort to which we devote ourselves. And if it fails, we'll have to take the consequences.
Final question to you, Secretary Baker. The period which we discussed earlier of German unification, the disappearance of the Soviet Union, was marked, as was said by all of you this evening, by exceedingly important personalities. Personality obviously matters. What's your answer to a student of international relations? What's your answer to this audience when you get the question, how important are personal relations as compared to, the national interest, the objective elements? Tell us about your own long experience in promoting the national interest, including through the creation of trustful personal relationships. How important is that?
Well, I'm a so-called realist in my approach to foreign policy. I think the national interest has to be paramount, although that national interest is founded upon and formed by our principles and values. So when you're trying to formulate or implement foreign policy for the United States, you've got to keep principles and values in mind, but above all else, I think the national interest. That's why we have dealt throughout history with regimes that don't share our principles and values. If it's in the national interest, we deal with it. We dealt with Stalin's Russia. Okay, we were allied with Stalin's Russia. So I think you have to. In each case, you have to look at the principles and values and the national interest. Personnel are policy, in my view. Everybody has their biases and their views with respect to issues. When you're staffing a big cabinet department like the State Department or the Treasury Department, and you pick personnel for important jobs, they're going to bring all their biases with them, and so personnel are policy. With respect to the issue of trust, which you touched upon, nothing is more important, in my view, in diplomacy or in foreign policy than having the best relationship you can have with your interlocutor. I determined fairly early, as I'm sure Hans Dietrich did, that Eduard Shevardnadze was someone who I could trust, whose word was good. If you can develop a relationship of trust with the guy across the table, you got a hell of a lot better chance of getting somewhere, making an agreement. So personnel are very important. I want to add one final comment to the question you asked me about what the press is talking about NATO moving eastward. Throughout all of our discussions with the Soviets, and I think Hans Dietrich will confirm this, we never had any discussion whatsoever that didn't relate to Germany. It was all about Germany. And we worked out an agreement, and we wrote it out, and they signed it. And it was an agreement that said no foreign troops will be on the soil of the GDR. So to now come along 25 years later and say somehow we promised with respect to a whole host of other countries, it's just baloney. Anyway, I thought I better
Thanks
add
for
that.
clarifying that. And I don't know how you all feel about this. I could go on for another hour or two with these two grand international leaders, wonderful friends of Germany, but we have to conclude this, otherwise I'll be criticized by our chairman. So I want to thank both of you. Let's give these two panelists a hand, and let's conclude the evening. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, I had a very fine speech prepared. Thank you, RJ. But those of you who know me know that I never miss a chance to let somebody else give a speech. So what I'm going to do now is to thank everybody for this unforgettable evening. I do want to thank Joe Jaffe, who originally approached Henry to persuade him that the Academy is the right forum to have an annual Henry Kissinger Prize, and it has become a cornerstone of our public program and reputation. I also want to thank those donors who immediately stepped up to support this idea and have supported it every year, and that's, of course, Bosch, with whom the Academy has a long-standing and profound relationship, and Cerberus, and also Porsche and Volkswagen. This year has been remarkable because we've had, and this is not a fundraising event, Henry. We promised you that. But when people come and say they would like to support this evening, because it's you, it's Secretary Baker, it's those two accents I grew up with, the German and the Texan, then we're grateful. And so we're very grateful to the generosity of the Honorable Mrs. Hushang Ansari, to the Honorable and Mrs. Edward Jurigian, a former distinguished visitor of the Academy, who helped launch our Middle East program, to Mercedes Bass, a friend of the Academy, thank you for coming back on this evening, to a trustee and close friends of the Academy, who we all love and admire, Helga and Ere van Haub, and the Unternehmensgruppe Tengelmann, who have watched this institution grow from the very first day and helped us, and Nina van Maltzahn, who supports us in so many ways, but has brought Curtis, the Curtis Institute, to Berlin and to the Academy every year, and on tour, and what extraordinary performances we just hear and are about to hear. I do want to thank the staff. I want to thank Lena Ringlev, who ran this event, and the entire staff of the Academy for stepping up. And I do want to thank Richard Holbrook, without whom this institution would not exist, who had the very prescient vision 5 years after the Berlin Wall fell, these 12 months that he was ambassador, and he understood just how dramatic, just how the relationship would change, and had the prescient idea of creating a kind of intellectual beachhead of America, as a place where about policy, anthropology, where one could deploy the entire range of knowledge you need to address a problem, especially in the modern age, and who, for some odd reason, came across me and gave me the privilege of helping to create this institution. Thank you very much.
It's been a long evening, but a wonderful experience. Thank you, Gary, and thank you to the Curtis Music Group, who will play a short piece for us to end the meeting properly.